I'm going to talk a little bit about the media and climate change and some of the insights from the research we do at the DCU Centre for Climate and Society. And as Claire was saying, climate change is, it's a geophysical problem. It's a problem of the climate sciences and so on. But really, at this stage, it is a communications problem, because all of the evidence and all of the science is in. And really, it's about how we as a society respond, and that the media has a huge role to play in that. So that's the kind of perspective, I suppose, of a lot of the work on our members in our research centre. There's a couple of things I'd like to just talk to you about. This Climate Change in the Irish Mind piece of research that Claire also referenced, which is about the levels of support out there for different forms of climate action. This piece of research was carried out by Yale University on behalf of the EPA, and kind of found that really there's huge amount of support out there, like 79% think it should be a high or very high priority. But however, if you try and put a cycle lane into Sandymount, or if you try and remove 1 or 2 car parking spaces from Lucan, you see that there's a huge gap between what people say and what people do. So I think that the media has a great role in exploring that gap as to what is going on there. What are the buttons that climate action is pressing? The same research was carried out in the States. They found the 6 different types of American attitudes to climate action. There's 4 Irelands, and the people who are really dismissive of climate science in Ireland is only about 3% of the population. So I think you should bear that in mind in terms of how much airtime you might give to somebody who's dismissive of climate action. I think you could be kind of misinforming or misleading your audience as to the extent of the prevalence of those kind of viewpoints. The reason you guys are so important in all this is that you're the main source of people's information about climate change. It's documentaries and major and local news organizations that people turn to for information about climate change. So Wolfgang Blau, who I'll mention later on, is a kind of key figure in this idea of how the media can best respond to the climate change crisis. And he sort of said, whether we want it or not, and I'm speaking as somebody who worked for 25 years as a journalist, whether we want this role or not, it's kind of falls to us to inform Irish people about climate change and climate action. And I think we have to, if we want to take our role seriously, have to think very hard about how we go about that. There's a couple of things that the media has a kind of power over audience in relation to. One is how often people see things and hear things in the media gives them a strong clue as to how important that is. And the second one is that how the media approach it, how they frame it, gives audiences a huge cue as to how they themselves should think about it. So if they are constantly hearing that climate action involves sacrifice, or that it involves only downsides or only costs and there's no upside or opportunity in there, that's how they will tend to think about it. So I've been trying in my work with media organizations to get them to think a little bit more reflectively about how they frame climate change and whether they're carrying out their social responsibility roles in the way that they go about framing it. I haven't really got time to go through a lot of this, but part of our research here would just track how the history of the coverage of climate change. It really only kicked off in the media in the late 80s, around 1988. And since then, it has seen huge peaks and troughs. So climate change is a story that can be suddenly everywhere and then nowhere. It peaks around the time of IPCC reports. It peaks around the time of annual COP conferences, and then it can disappear almost completely. There's no really ongoing research about Irish coverage. This is some of my research that ended in 2016, showing roughly the same patterns as elsewhere. Big peaks around COPs and IPCC assessment reports, and then fading to very low levels. Over the 10 years I looked at coverage in the print media, it was less than 1% of total news coverage, climate change. Now, my sense is, although there's nobody actually monitoring this, that it's become much more prevalent on the news agenda. There's very little research into the broadcast media. The broadcast media, especially radio, but also TV, is vastly under-researched around the world because it's very difficult to get data. So this was one piece, an old piece of research, nearly 10 years old now, looking at the 6-1 News, the RT News website, and prime time, showing just how infrequently it found that the coverage was low and sporadic. So RTE did a themed climate week in 2019. They put huge resources and huge kind of push behind climate coverage across all their platforms. They did a bit of research to coincide with that. They found that the concern about climate change is very high. It's people aren't, it can be a tough sell programming wise to get people to watch climate programming, but the kind of creativity that Daniela and her colleagues have shown can really help to do that. And also, I think from my point of view, the whole literacy piece is really missing. People don't. It's one of those things, I don't know, a bit like the backstop, Northern Ireland backstop back in the day, where the time to understand it has sort of passed, and now it's embarrassing to admit you don't really know how climate change works. So I think media organizations, for instance, we did a piece of work with the Examiner group, and as part of that, we supplied little fact boxes about what is net zero, what is biogenic methane, what are Ireland's targets, what's the circular economy, little explainers that drop into all of their articles that just do that that kind of literacy piece about trying to inform your audiences and improve their literacy. And by the way, improve your own, your own group's literacy, because journalists and broadcasters need that as well. This is, again, from that piece of research about the print media, about how it's framed. So really often, and this is kind of what I try and get at in this work with the broadcasting organizations, journalists are trained to see news in a certain way, and it's usually around conflict and political contest. So, and I can remember from my own days in the newsroom, if the government announced something, there would be tremendous kind of reflex to go and find somebody who disagreed with it. So you're constantly setting up conflict, and that can that can work as journalism, but it doesn't tend to work for climate change. This is some data from the Reuters Digital News Report for 2022. We're just working on the 2023 version of it now, about who people pay attention to. You can see that the scientists and so on in the media, you should note, and then TV and film documentaries and major news organizations. So the media organizations have a big role to play in this. This is a question about what should media organizations focus on when they report on climate change. So governments and large companies is the biggest. So for me, this suggests that people kind of understand that individual action, it's important, but it's the big systems like energy and agriculture that are producing most of the emissions and that need to change. So the people don't really feel that kind of individual sort of climate shaming type coverage is what they want. This is kind of interesting because it's about whether the media should be neutral or whether it should take a stand in favor of climate action. So it's broken down by age as well, but there's the old-fashioned view of the media is that it simply reports on stuff. It's like a robot that goes out and just, you know, takes down what people said and reports what happened in a neutral, balanced, objective way. There's a growing group of people who want the news organizations to have a view, to come at this from a position in favor of climate action. This really surprised me, this finding that in the 18 to 24 age group, 21% of 18 to 24-year-olds want news outlets to take a clear position against climate action. So this seemed to undermine the whole idea of the Greta Thunberg generation being totally engaged in this issue. So there's a proportion of younger people who, you know, aren't engaged, and that's a challenge, I suppose, or that's something that, you know, the media can help with. I haven't got a huge amount of time, but I'm going to just talk that there's our old friend Wolfgang Blau, and he's I suppose a really good guy, along with Katharine Hayhoe, who's a Texan climate scientist. So Wolfgang Blau, Katharine Hayhoe, and a guy called George Marshall, who was over here there the other day advising the government. They're three people I would really recommend that you pay attention to on how to communicate about climate change in different contexts. So I'm going to just share some of Wolfgang's ideas, and just to note that there is a climate journalism network that is basically climate literacy training for journalists, run by the Reuters Institute in Oxford. It takes in 50 or 60 journalists every. A couple of Irish journalists have done their course, and the call opens every year, and it's free. So if somebody in you might steer or promote that amongst in your organization for those who want to kind of really up their knowledge on climate change. So again, to echo what Claire was saying, Wolfgang talks a lot about what are the words to use, and the words to use fit into the framing as well. But should we call it climate change? Should we call it climate crisis? Should we call it climate emergency? There's different arguments about each phrase, but crisis and emergency suggest it's a short-lived kind of one-off problem, rather than something systemic that's going to go on for a long time. So this piece of research suggests that climate breakdown is a good phrase to bring into how you talk about climate change. Another tip is to go back to this idea of climate literacy for journalists. Do they understand what the greenhouse effect is? Do they know how to access reputable, reliable, peer-reviewed information? Do they know how to read a scientific report and evaluate scientific research? Do they understand the difference between the different temperature scenarios between 1.5 and 2 degrees? What a world at 2 degrees look like? Do they understand carbon budgets and sectoral targets and inventories and trend? Do they know about the carbon reporting obligations that are coming down on companies? And I suppose really understanding what Ireland's carbon budget is and how we are spending it is, I think, a key thing. So like I've noticed recently, and it's a really tough one for journalists. And my research comes at this from a kind of journalist-centric point of view and how challenging this is for journalists. But you're getting a lot of people coming to the media who are flat out lying about different aspects of climate change. They are deliberately misleading people about, for instance, whether the carbon cost of a wind turbine or electric cars or different, any form of climate action. There's a kind of counter argument that actually this plan is worse than for the climate than burning oil and gas. So it's very difficult for journalists to be able to fact check that in real time and to be able to have the information at their fingertips to say, hold on a second, I'm not sure that's true, or, so this is the literacy piece that I think is a real tough one for hard-pressed, under-resourced media organizations to have the time to do the research, to be able to hold certain viewpoints to account. Another tip is to try and increase the climate literacy in your audiences. So again, I was saying these little fact boxes or little things maybe on your website that are explainers that just point people to the right information. You can try and some organizations have kind of carbon counters, or in their weather reports, they say what the parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is that day, or they talk about air pollution data and so on. So they bring in a little bit of literacy into different parts of, of their news bulletins, their weather bulletins, some of their kind of chat shows. I know that we're talking largely about very under-resourced newsrooms. So in bigger organizations, journalists tend to think that every problem can be solved by, quotes, more journalism. So they tend to, we'll beef up this desk and we'll beef up that desk and we'll do special issues and we'll do themed weeks and we'll basically throw more journalism at it. But there's something to be said to just getting a bunch of like-minded people who work in all parts of your organization together and see what they come up with, So I think it was Claire who was saying about teams. You don't know where the people that will be on that team come from. They, could come from. But the main thing is that they're interested in it. They want to find out more about it, and they. So Wolfgang's idea is to just increase the climate literacy of your staff and see what happens, see what they come up with. There's a couple of other things that the media, I think, need to be wary of. One is this kind of 50-50 balance as bias idea that you get two people, one pro, one anti. So scientists or journalists don't really understand the extent of the scientific consensus on climate change, which is around 98% of scientists. So if you're going to have 50-50, 98-2, that doesn't work, does it? So you need to kind of think about that. And I think even from my own experience in the newsroom, journalists are always being, approached by people with different interests, different interest groups, different activist groups, different lobbies and pressure groups. And there's a tendency to see the environment as, just another one of these from a newsroom point of view, people on the end of a phone giving out to you about something. So I really think that that's a kind of mindset that we need to change inside newsrooms, that this isn't just cranks or crackpots. This is a huge story. The other thing that we need to think about is the visuals. How we there's a link there to some kind. We need to diversify how we visualize climate change on our websites and so on. That polar bears and smokestacks and so on don't engage people. You need solutions-oriented visuals. You need visuals with people in them. You need to show this as a very widespread topic. Teresa, how am I doing on time?
Very good. About 5 minutes or so. That's
5 minutes, okay. The other thing I would like, we've done a bit of research here about journalists, climate journalists' experience online. It's horrific. And little piece I've done recently has shown that it's got even more horrific since the Musk takeover of Twitter. So there's a huge increase in the amount of trolling of climate journalists and climate scientists online in Musk's Twitter. So journalists on social media are quite vulnerable to this thing, and they're, especially some of our students, feel like they're sort of lambs to the slaughter. So I think media organizations need to prepare their staff for this kind of environment, to get them to familiarize themselves with the most common forms of climate denial, the arguments that it's sunspots, or it's not really warming, or the data sets are wrong, or whatever it might be. So there are resources out there that will enable you to understand and counteract the most common forms of trolling and denial, which I suppose relates to this idea. And like, I totally acknowledge this is a huge responsibility, and it's a huge amount of work to understand such a vast field and then understand the social forces at play. One thing that you could be aware of is the discourses of climate delay. These are the kind of discourses that people who want to delay climate action engage in. Now, sometimes they engage in them totally in good faith, but I think just in the way that you would hold Eamon Ryan to account if he came on to talk about, I don't know, the offshore wind auction that happened last week. So you should hold others to account by being aware of these kind of rhetorical strategies, such as emphasizing the downsides of climate action, or maybe saying it's up to somebody else to take action. We don't have to take action here, or that there's no point, it's happening, and we're all doomed, or that we can change, but we don't need to change that much. We can tinker. Or that anything that requires any change, or any, for instance, carbon taxation or different measures, that's not just politically possible. So I think it's good for journalists and program makers to be aware that these are out there, so that when they come across them, they can interrogate them in the same way that they might interrogate somebody who's pro climate action. This is sometimes you hear that climate stories on news websites or climate programming doesn't do well, and that we've tried it, the audience isn't interested, it's not for us. I think that Wolfgang Blau makes the point that it can be seen a little bit as editorial greenwashing in your own organization. Yes, we've ticked that box and we've done that thing, but have we really tried it? Have we put all the creativity, all the energy, all the marketing into this story, or are we just going through the motions of, mentioning it in news bulletins or whatever? So I think that's a good way to think about it. Are we giving this our best shot, or are we just going through the motions? Another point that media organizations need to be careful about is attribution of extreme weather to climate change. So, there's always a tendency, I suppose, to say, to what extent was this caused by climate change? So attribution studies take a while to run, because they need huge amount of computing power to discern the fingerprint of climate change in any one event. So the worldweatherattribution.org is a great resource for journalists. It kind of tells you how attribution science works. And I suppose what we can always say is that climate change makes extreme weather events more frequent and more intense when they do happen. But it does take, I think the fastest complete attribution study took 9 days of running a big computer 24 hours a day to run the model to work that out. So yeah, I'll finish up with just a couple of ideas here about train your staff and see what happens, see what they come up with, empower them to come up with ideas. Yes, you can go with special programs and you know, slots and in programs and so on, but in a way, you know, we've tried that before. We've tried that with other kind of big stories, and it isn't working with climate change. Climate change Catherine Hayhoe is very good on this. Climate change coverage can be seeded in every department, in every beat, in every kind of story. There is an argument that I frequently make that climate change and the environment have got to be the kind of taken for granted context for every news item, the way jobs and the economy are now, so that we understand that everything happens in an environmental context. So the local GAA, local anglers groups, walking groups, swimming groups, reporting on them and what they notice about their changing environment is a way to talk about climate change without talking about without politicizing it, and showing that everything in our community happens within the environment, and without the environment, you know, nothing happens. So yeah, thanks very much for the opportunity. I'll leave it there.